Yeah, we're happy to see everybody. Lisa Davison, Reverend Dr. Lisa Davison, is with us this morning. And for those of you who have never heard Lisa before, fairly new to our class, you're going to be very happy you're here this week and next week because Lisa will be with us. Lisa and I visited and we kind of figured out she's been coming to our class for the last at least 10 years, maybe 12. And she's one of our favorite speakers. So welcome, Lisa. We're glad to have you this morning. And it's all yours. You've got yours now. Okay. You bet.
Is this working? Yes, it is. It's good to be with you all. It's been a while. Part of that is because I'm a little busy. You may have noticed I have an extra title under my name, and I didn't even put the third one because it was getting ridiculous. But since July 1st, I have been serving as the Interim Vice President of Academic Affairs and Dean at Phillips Theological Seminary, while also being the Johnnie Eargle Cadieux Professor of Hebrew Bible and the Director of Formation for our Disciples of Christ students. So just a little busy of late, but I'm glad we found a place in my schedule that I could come be with you. I think you're about the happiest class on Sunday morning I encounter. I speak at other ones. Because I've been coming here for at least 10 to 12 years, I am like, okay, have I presented this before to the Challengers class? Have I presented this? I think this is a new one. Not something new for you all, but certainly something that I have not talked about. And that is this idea of taking care of the least of these in God's beloved community. When we look at the Hebrew Bible, there are two words that kind of get used for community. The first one is kahal, which is the actual root word for the verb to gather. And so kahal is often used for any gathering of people in any time or place. The other word is edah. Edah means, it comes from the root meaning to appoint or assign. And this is usually used for a group that has been called together for a special purpose or appointed, sort of like an ad hoc committee kind of idea. Do get used for community. And just a reminder, in ancient Israel, the community was more important than the individual in many ways, because they understood better than we do today that what one person does affects more than just that one person. So they took very seriously the idea of how to care for the community and how to live in covenant with one another so that all could be at least taken care of on their basic needs. So the least of these. This is a phrase that comes for most people the first time in Matthew 25, when Jesus has the parable of the goats and the sheep and the whole kind of idea of when I was naked, you didn't clothe me. When I was hungry, you didn't feed me. And the question comes, when did we see you that way? And Jesus says, even as you do it unto the least of these, you have done it unto me. But actually, Jesus didn't come up with this concept of feeding the hungry and clothing the naked and visiting the imprisoned. He was actually drawing from his Jewish traditions about this. So the concept had long been established in the Hebrew Bible that the Holy commanded everyone to take care of the least of these in their community in the ancient world. And one way that I connect Jesus' parable with the Hebrew Bible is this text from Isaiah 58. You may have heard it used multiple different times. But in this particular text, this is a post-exilic community being a prophetic voice. That it seemed like the post-exilic community trying to rebuild Jerusalem and the walls and the temple, sometimes wanted to just moan and groan and not do anything about it. And so this text is about how they went around fasting and in sackcloth, making a good show of their despair or their frustration. But the prophet comes along and says, is this not the fast that I choose, speaking on behalf of the holy, to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house, when you see the naked to cover them, and not your... Oh, I'm reading upside down. So from your own kin, then your light shall break forth, your healing spring forth. And it goes on to say, you will cry, and the holy will say, here I am. And again, we get into food to the hungry, the needs of the afflicted. And of course, that first part is actually what Jesus kind of read when he was in the synagogue that day. Oop, I just hit the blink. All right. So in the Hebrew Bible, who were the least of these in an ancient Near Eastern context? Primarily, the two categories that were included in this least of these were widows, and the other group would be called orphan. Now, what did it mean to be a widow in the ancient Near East? Now, you're thinking, Lisa, that's an easy one. You don't have a husband anymore. But particularly in the ancient world, a woman who was a widow had no husband and had no sons. So she had no one to take care of her once her husband died. If she had sons, they would care for her. A younger widow may not have a relative who could perform the levirate marriage, which we see in the book of Ruth, where when a husband dies, the nearest kin is to marry his widow, especially if there have been no children, then to reproduce, if possible, an heir to the deceased's land and other inheritance. So you have no husband, you have no sons, there's no possibility for a levirate marriage, and also you have no land of your own. So that created the widow of the ancient world. If you didn't have land, you couldn't raise your own crops. If you didn't have a husband or sons, you were going to be pushed into the practice probably of begging for food, or at least asking for food in different ways. An orphan then, of course, was a child that their parents had usually died, but more importantly, they had no relative who could take them in. Very common in the ancient world that if a child's parents die, the next of kin would take them in and raise them as their own. But an orphan, again, would be someone who has no one to take care of them. And they are then on their own to find food and other needs for their lives. So what we find, particularly in the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, are these repeated phrases that talk about the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. And I'm going to come back to stranger in a moment. But here you have last people, last verse, cursed be anyone who deprives the alien, the orphan, and the widow of justice. And all the people shall say amen. So, right up front, the thing you have to do is deliver justice to everyone, but particularly a widow, an orphan, or a stranger. God kind of says, I'm going to take that as a personal affront, because your role is to take care of the least of these. Isaiah 1 picks back up and says, wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove the evil, cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the need for the widow. So orphan and widow, no way to sustain themselves, so they had to, yes?
I never thought of this before. Is there an age limit on
if it were a male child, if he reached a particular age, he would probably be expected to go on his own. Or the family that's raising him, if they are treating him like a son, then he would marry and bring his wife into the household.
18, 19,
Yeah, we don't know. Men probably got married a little later because women didn't marry until they had started menstruating. So, good question, though. And then the stranger. So I've talked about the widow, talked about the orphan. Who is this stranger? Or sometimes it's called alien in your translation. Now, of course, you're talking with kids and you say alien, they immediately think of Martians or something like that, which is why I tend to use stranger instead of alien for myself. In Hebrew, the word ger is a verb that means to sojourn. And so ger is the word we use, or gar, for a stranger in Hebrew. They are a sojourner, a temporary resident, either by choice or by circumstance, who lives in your community. So they end up choice or chance, refugee by circumstance, choice, they are traveling maybe somewhere else and they've decided to sojourn with you a while. They are considered a stranger. You may remember Moses named one of his sons Gershom, and he said, because I have been a stranger in a strange land. And even more apparent is the story of Hagar. It actually means Hagar, the stranger. So the name itself identifies her as being in a status that is vulnerable. Especially if you are a female and you end up in a community where you're the stranger, you are going to be extremely vulnerable to outside risks of how the community responds to you. In the Hebrew Bible, the stranger or alien was guaranteed certain rights and protections, which they weren't guaranteed in other cultures. So Israel, at least according to the Torah, was saying, if we have a stranger among us, we have to treat them fairly, justly. So Leviticus 19:33 says, "The stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the stranger." So if they come into your community, you can't just automatically arrest them or put them somewhere that they might have called a jail or a holding place. You had to at least welcome them and treat them like a member of your society, not as the stranger we might want to. Now, what do you do when this widow, orphan, and stranger ends up in your community and they have land and they have no job or work perhaps, and they are hungry and they need something to eat? Well, this is probably the situation behind this text in Deuteronomy 24, where it says, if you are harvesting a field of grain and forget a sheaf in the field, don't go back and get it. It shall be left for the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all your undertakings. Yes, sir?
What category is the daughter of the widow?
Oh, she'd be in even worse situation. Because if the family doesn't take her in, she has no chance of marriage. And she would be, at that point, more like an orphan, even if... And oftentimes, women in the ancient world who had no protector, no husband, no brothers, not even an uncle maybe who would take care of them, they did end up in prostitution because that was one way for them to make money.
So they become a stranger too.
Yes. Good point. Yes. As a whole, females were always vulnerable, but as long as they had a male to protect them, then they were safer, so to speak. Likewise, when you beat your olive trees, now I don't know anything about olive trees, but I have seen them beating them, and that's how you get the olives fruit to fall down so you can pick it up. You will not strip your tree. Don't take everything. Leave a little behind. And who is going to utilize what you've left behind? The stranger, the orphan, and the widow. Same thing if you have a vineyard. Leave something behind for the widow, the stranger, and the orphan. I often say this may have been the earliest attempt at a food bank. The only difference being, right now, thankfully, our food banks do not require hungry people to work to get that food. If they leave the boundary of their field, or some of their olives, or some of their grapes, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger still had to work. They had to go and glean what was left over. Now, this shows up, too, in the book of Ruth. You may remember when Ruth and Naomi returned to Bethlehem, and they have no one to take care of them. Ruth goes out into the field to gather with the other widows, orphans, and strangers the edges of their fields when they're harvesting. Also, in Exodus 22, you shall not oppress a stranger. Why? For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. This is the shows up is the Israelites are reminded after they leave in Egypt that they don't treat people the way they've been treated. They are to treat people the way they have been taught in Torah. So when we talk about love your neighbor as yourself, it does go on to say love the stranger too. Because again, all of this is a communal balance to keep everyone healthy. You shall not abuse the widow or orphan. If you do abuse them, when they cry out to me, I will surely heed their cry. My wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children orphans. Now, I know God's having a little snit here about this, but this shows you how seriously that kind of care of the least of these was taken, at least from a divine perspective, through the prophets and through other writings. And notice what's going to happen. Obviously, if this is addressed at males, because they were the ones who were in the public square, were most likely to be considering cases for justice, etc. If you treat the widow, the orphan, and the stranger unfairly, then your wife and your children will become the widow and the orphan. See that equation they got going on there? And so you should treat the widow, the orphan, and the stranger the way you would want your family treated if they ended up in those vulnerable categories. Now, those were just a few of the texts that deal with widow, stranger, and orphan. They're all throughout the Torah, the first 5 books. They're in the prophets, particularly like the Isaiah 1 text, pre-existing prophets, those speaking to Israel and Judah when first the Assyrians and then the Babylonians were on the march to conquer the ancient Near East. And one of the things that those pre-existing prophets talked about was, you're not doing what you've been told to do. Particularly, you are not practicing justice. You are not showing mercy and compassion to the most vulnerable. And therefore, your society is messed up. And what's coming is going to be really bad, because the Assyrians don't care what your status is. They're not going to take care of you. And the Babylonians don't either. So this preparatory work for the coming disasters. And I think I have mentioned here before that, I don't think that Isaiah was saying if you get your act together, the Assyrians will go the other way or the Babylonians will go the other way. That wasn't going to change. At this point, it was the Babylonians. They were marching south through the northern kingdom. They were going to hit the southern kingdom on their way to Egypt. And therefore, you are going to fall. You can't stand up to this big army. And so what I've often said is the prophets are pointing out these places where you're not following Torah and saying, address these, because when we are under a foreign empire, if you haven't addressed these places where justice is lacking, there's no way you can do it under the Assyrians or the Babylonians. So again, not saying you can get it right and God will say, okay, Babylonians, I want you to go over the Mediterranean Sea, even though you're not a seafaring people, or I want you to go around and go through the desert. No, they're going to come. Get your act together. So whatever happens, you are taking care of the vulnerable people in your midst. So I want to stop and see if there's a question. Yes?
Divorcees, were they treated as,
That's a good thing. If your spouse divorced you, and that's the male divorced the woman, then she would probably go back to her home of origin. But when she walked into that family structure, she would probably go down the list of where she was in importance because she had brought shame on her family, etc. If her family would not take her back, then she becomes basically an orphan, and not quite a widow, but she's a female orphan. And she too would have to rely on these other boundaries that have been established for taking care of the least of these. Now, probably it was later than when Isaiah was working, but in the 2nd century or before BCE, Jewish women could divorce their husbands. It was an extra thing as the laws or the commandments were being adapted to new contexts. They did allow a woman to do a divorce when her husband was not treating her correctly. So it sounds a little one-sided right now, but they do develop into a place where not just men, but women too can start a divorce. Any other questions about that? All right, well, let's move on then. Welcoming the other or the stranger or the alien. This is where I bring in the concept of hospitality in the ancient Near East. I may have talked about this before in other contexts, but just when you hear the word hospitality, what comes to mind? Welcoming. What else? Food. Openness. Bed. Is that what I heard? Okay. Others? Nurturing. Good. Sharing. Very good. Y'all know your hospitality gig here. I often think about hospitality as a word we use a lot, but we don't always mean the fullness of what hospitality is. There is, of course, now the hospitality industry, and you can get a degree in that field to work particularly with hotels or convention centers or other places. I think you on one piece, hospitality, welcoming, making someone feel at home, providing lodging and food, etc., which where I grew up in Southwest Virginia, that meant sweet tea and cookies or something. And of course, much to my dear departed mother's chagrin, I never liked sweet tea. I don't even like iced tea at all. So, welcoming, you said, friendliness, graciousness, courtesy. Yeah. So when we talk about hospitality, in many ways, we are talking about love of the stranger. That is, how are you going to welcome a stranger to make them feel at home, to give them what they need, and other things that hospitality would control. Now, this is where I'm going to work into a little language that isn't Hebrew. Believe it or not, I have read a few things. So it's philoxenia. Philoxenia is the Greek word that often gets connected to hospitality, which we get the word xenophile, and it comes from two words. The first word is love, philos, and the second word, xenia, stranger or strange. So it literally means love of stranger, which is the exact opposite of xenophobia. Yes, which we probably see a whole lot of in our world today, but that is the same thing, xenia, strange, and phobia, fear, instead of philos, love. So it's the opposite of xenophobia. So in the ancient Near East, back in these BCE period, when some of these stories of the Hebrew Bible were being told and eventually written down, hospitality was extremely important. It was an obligation. That's one word we didn't use for hospitality. But in the ancient Near East, hospitality was an obligation, not a courtesy. It was even considered sacred, especially among the Israelites that we have stories from. It was necessary for survival. If you were a traveler going a long distance and you came to a home or city, you needed to be taken care of, or at least given a place to safely spend the night. That was hospitality. The area of the ancient Near East, water was limited. If you did not have a source of water, you would not be able to survive your journey, more than if you didn't have direct access to food. And as I always like to say, you all get this, there were no Motel 6s leaving the light on for you. When I do that with a younger crowd, I never get a chuckle at all on that one. I guess it has been a while since Motel 6's ad was like that. So travelers were at the mercy of residents where they were journeying or where they were sojourning, as we talked about. And there were certain codes of conduct that went with that. Like I said, in many places in the ancient Near East, strangers didn't have any rights or protections. But from what we can tell in the Israel stories, they were trying to put up those protections. You needed to also, though, provide protection for the community where the stranger has arrived. So it's both and. Protect the stranger and protect the community. So strict codes of conduct developed that would govern these kinds of situations where a stranger comes and needs a place to rest or reside. It offered hospitality, but the stranger had to agree that they would do no harm to their hosts. Mutual, not one-sided. And again, even when Israel stories are talking about them as nomadic, living in tents and not a settled community, it applied in that context as well as when they might have settled and had more tangible homes, permanent homes. So there were 3 requirements of hospitality. You've already named at least 2 of them, maybe. One was food. So a stranger comes to your home, you were to offer them something to eat. Water. You also should provide them water to drink as well as water to wash their feet, thinking about them wandering through this area in sandals. Their feet would get very dirty, or any other place they wanted to wash. And shelter. So shelter, a place to stay if they needed one for the night. The code of behavior then it goes like this. Stranger comes, they need some food, water, and shelter. And so you agree to welcome them, for them to stay, usually for a particular time period. This is to prevent those guests like my cousin Hal, who never knew how to end his visit. So, the stranger has the right of refusal. They don't have to accept your extension of hospitality. But that would have been a great offense if you said no to the hospitality. Just like I've told this story maybe here, but in other places, when I was in Israel for the first time, and finally the tour guide decided I was in charge and not my male colleague, even though he kept thinking that, invited me to join him for dining while everybody else was down here in the crowded restaurant. The two of us went up to a dining space where no one else was going to be, and we didn't order. We just had food brought. And this was a place by the Sea of Galilee, and they served me St. Peter's fish. Now, I don't know how they kept it so well preserved since the time that St. Peter caught one. And I like fish, but this came as the whole fish with the eyeball staring up at me. And my finicky childhood wouldn't eat anything self was ready to come out. And then I thought, no, I have been offered this hospitality. I can't not eat it. So I didn't eat the eyeball, but I did eat some of the fish. And then afterwards, the tour guide invited me to go out back behind the restaurant, thinking now I might not should have done that. My companion Michael was eating with everyone else and didn't know where I was. And when I went out the back with him, there was an Arab man making coffee over an open fire and wanted to share that with us. I like coffee, but this was stronger than any espresso you can imagine. I mean, it was just a little bitty cup. And again, what was I going to do? Hospitality, I have to take advantage of this gift that they are giving me. So I drank it, and then when I showed up, Michael said I was bouncing off the bus. So once you accept this invitation, the roles of the host and guest usually work this way. The guest doesn't ask for anything because they shouldn't have to. The host provides the best he, or they have in order to do those three things: food, water, and shelter. The guest is expected to bring news. You know, they've been traveling on the road. They have news to share or some other way to express gratitude, maybe a gift of some sort that they had with them. And the host cannot ask personal questions of the guest. This would be really hard where I come from, because when you showed up, you were in for 100 questions, and you had to answer them all. But back then, you couldn't ask about the guest's personal life. So, those things were the way it went: food, water, news, gratitude, spend the night if needed, before continuing on in the journey. If you think about it, according to the stories in the Hebrew Bible, all of our ancestors in the faith are portrayed as wanderers who would rely on the hospitality of others. Abe and Sarah were wandering. They left their homeland to go to a land that God would show them. And 2 different times they had to go through a foreign land, such as Egypt and then later Gerar, and they were going to be reliant on those folks' hospitality to survive. Now, you may remember Abe decided that his wife was so good looking that she had to say she was his sister, because otherwise the men in the community might kill him to get to her. And so Sarah ended up in the Pharaoh's harem, essentially, to make certain that Abraham was protected. Isaac and Rebekah, same story. Remember, Rebekah had to leave her homeland and go to marry Isaac sight unseen. That would have been hard. And maybe when she got there, she got more than she bargained for, because Isaac was a troubled person. They too end up in Gerar, where Isaac, father like son, says, pretend to be my sister. But the ruler in that one was pretty smart. He looked out the window and saw Rebekah and Isaac having a necking session and realized that he had been fooled, which isn't included in the Abe and Sarah parallel story, which maybe they were too old for the necking, though I would like to think you never get too old for necking. But certainly Isaac and Rebekah showed their romance to someone else. Jacob was also a wanderer, so he would have been a stranger. So all of them at one point or another were reliant on the hospitality of strangers. So you can almost hear the divine saying, you shall welcome the stranger because you were once strangers yourself. You shall give hospitality to the stranger because you once relied on the stranger of others, or on the hospitality of a stranger. So, any thoughts or comments? I don't know what time we finish. 10:30? Oh, good. We have time. If you need to leave now, it's fine. I'll assume that it's not because of what I said, but all right. So let's look at some examples of hospitality in the Hebrew Bible. The first one and most well-known one is Genesis 18. We focus on Abraham, but Sarah was there. Somebody had to do the rest of the cooking and everything else while Abe is entertaining those guests. But you remember the story that Sarah and Abraham had a tent near the oaks of Mamre, and Abe was outside sitting, watching the wind blow, whatever he did down there. And he sees 3 people approaching the area. Now, we, from the storyteller's vantage point, know that those are 3 angels. But for Abraham and Sarah, they're just 3 people they don't know. And so what does Abraham do? He ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. Now, that's really something. That's extra hospitality. Talk about treating them as special guests. You're showing obeisance to these people. And then he asks, if it's what you would like, come and have water and wash your feet, rest yourself. Bring a little bread that you may refresh yourself, and afterwards you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. So he's doing all 3 things: water, food, and shelter to rest from their travels. And of course, Abraham tells Sarah to quick make some food. We got guests. And he goes out, and he doesn't just take any old animal from his flock. He takes a calf that is tender and good. Is that veal? Is that what we'd think about? One time my niece was on her graduation trip with us, and she was a picky eater as well. She's not anymore. And she wondered what veal was. And I had a dilemma. So I told her it's young, tender beef. Now, I didn't lie, did I? But if I had told her it was a calf, she wouldn't have touched it. So she ended up liking it. And so also remember, they sit down and they're having food. And while they ate, they said to Abraham, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "There in the tent." And then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season. Your wife shall have a son." So what did I say often the stranger brought? News, a message. A little extreme, but still a message. And of course, Sarah laughs, and I won't get into that because that's a whole nother area. But right here, we have Abraham and Sarah being the ideal hosts, hostess with the mostest. They are taking care of these three strangers that they literally don't know who they are, where they came from, or where they're going. Another good example is Rebekah herself. When Abraham's getting old, he asks his servant to go back to Abe's homeland and find a wife for Isaac. Now, this is odd. Most patriarchs find their own wives. Isaac's the only one that needs someone else to find a wife, and as I said, get her to agree to marry him without even laying eyes on him. So when this servant goes, and he's got an entourage with him because he's got to get a woman to bring back for his master's son, and he comes to that well, and he decides it's a good place to rest. And it says in verse 15, before he had even finished speaking, I need to back up. Remember, I think this is right before he had said, "Oh God, show me who this person is that should be the next wife, or my master's son's wife. Whoever comes and offers water, I'll know that's the sign." One of those prayers that if-then actually worked. Most of the time, I don't think if-then prayers often work. So he had just finished speaking these words when Rebekah shows up. She was born to Bethuel, son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother. So she's got the right family lineage. She's coming out with her water jar on her shoulder to get water to bring back home. When the servant ran to meet her and said, "Please let me have a little sip of water from your jar." Now, he's not quite playing by the rules where you're not supposed to ask for anything, but that's okay. And it says that she gave him something to drink, and then she didn't stop there. She continued to give water to his entourage as well as to his animals. So now you have Rebekah doing a great act of hospitality, even taking care of the strangers' animals. And when everyone had finished, a man took a gold nose ring weighing half a shekel and 2 bracelets for Rebekah's arms that each were 10 gold shekels worth, and said, "Tell me whose daughter you are. Is there room in your father's house to spend the night?" And she told him. And then she said, "We have plenty of straw and fodder and a place to spend the night." So Rebekah is also an excellent example of a host, going above and beyond what was required of her. Now she, unlike most hosts, does get something, the jewelry, but that tells her only one thing, that the person who sent this servant has money, which also might help convince her that she wants to leave home and go. I have this image of being maybe just the youngest or the one that couldn't get married, and she is so unhappy living where she is that she'd do anything to get out of town. All right. Any questions about Abe and Rebekah? All right. One more example in the few minutes we have left. The Shunammite woman. Now, most people will look at me and say, who? What? This is a story that often gets overlooked because we are focusing on the prophet and not the hostess. But the prophet Elisha has been passing through Shunem, and he meets a wealthy woman and she urges him to have a meal. So whenever he comes to town, she gives him a meal, which reminds me of the old days, when the pastor might have been riding a circuit, and the last church that got the pastor that day would offer them a meal, that kind of hospitality. And so the woman said to her husband, "Look, I am sure that this man who regularly passes our way is a holy man of God." Notice the woman is taking the lead here. It says that she's wealthy, not that her family was wealthy. And so let us make a small roof chamber with walls and put there for him a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp, so he can stay there whenever he comes to us. And that's what he did. So not only is she offering him access to food and water, but shelter also. She builds a room in her home just for the prophet. That's pretty extensive hospitality. My last year of seminary, I was serving a church in Plano, Texas, but living in Arlington, Texas. And so my schedule was I went over to Plano on Saturday morning and usually had youth things going on. And every weekend I spent the night with a different family in the church. They were like my Shunammite woman. They opened their home, they welcomed me, some more than others. And I used to joke when they'd say, somebody might ask, "Well, how are you with pastoral visits? Do you have trouble coming up with something to say for 30 minutes or an hour?" I'm like, I did almost 15-hour pastoral visits every weekend with a different family in the church. My preceding church was in Garland, and I went over there on Sundays. And then this one family that had a young daughter volunteered to house me every Sunday night. And they did have a room, sort of like a guest suite, that was mine every Sunday night. I don't know if anybody ever stayed there except for me. Incredible hospitality. Thoughts? Yes, Hank? Oh, 4 minutes. I thought you said 4 questions. Go for it. Y'all are awfully quiet.
I think about applying this to our world today. And I think I'm not very good at this. And I also think part of it is fear. I'm wondering what role did fear play in these earlier days? Was it the same as it is for us today? Or was it not as much?
I think certainly there was fear because you didn't know who was wandering through. But because that probably these customs of hospitality were so ingrained into the culture, and the rules of conduct both for the host and for the stranger were not quite set in stone, but pretty strict, they probably had less concern. Because again, the host offers, the guest takes it, and then the guest could not do anything to harm the host or anyone under the host's roof. So I'm sure there was fear, but they also had something a little different than we do now with threats. I mean, there were not too long ago in this country that people would leave their back doors and front doors open, and I've heard stories of people, particularly who live near a train station or train track, that often the people who were traveling on the train, not with a ticket, would come to their back door and they would give them food. So it's true that our threats have really made this harder for us. But even if you can't do it in your personal home, a church can do that. And
maybe the sense of sacredness or theology about sacredness of this somehow mitigated that
yeah.
fear somehow, some way.
Yeah, that's right. And next week I'll tell you a couple of stories about not so good hosts. So
You'll hear about Southern hospitality. Do we have a Northern
I don't know. The northern hospitality does not have quite the same cultural spin to it. I remember going to visit Yale, looking at seminaries and div schools, and we went in January, which was the wrong time for this person to go. And I remember thinking, like, walking as fast as I could to the next warm place I could be. And I thought, well, it's no wonder they don't stop and talk to everybody. It's cold and nobody can stand. In the South, you can mosey because it's a little warmer. But no. Thank you all very much. It was great to be with you.